about marriage because everything kind of sits on that. You know, life is full of tons of challenges, and all those challenges rest on the base of a marriage. So talking about marriage, trying to make marriage is a privilege. What I'm going to do tonight is a little bit different. You asked me for some background, Tully. So my primary work is as a couples therapist. And a lot of what you're going to be seeing here tonight is couples therapy, is what I've seen in couples therapy, what I've seen in terms of good marriages, bad marriages. So a lot of it is going to be based on that. I'm a couples therapist in Muncie, working with the Orthodox community. In terms of questions, please send in your questions. Please send in on the chat, and I'll look at them. But I probably won't get to the questions until after I finish the material that we want to cover. What I want to do tonight, it's a little bit different. This is not a how do we have a good marriage skills. This is not about learning the skills of a good marriage, communication skills, etc. This is more about, I want to take you into the home of a couple that's in a good marriage. And I want to take you into the home of a couple that's not in a good marriage. And just kind of notice the differences between them. Some of this is based on my own experience. You know, if a couple comes into therapy, what do they look like before? What do they look like? What do they look like afterwards? And some of it is based on research. It's just a little bit of history over here. If you go back about 40 years, couples therapy was pretty much, it wasn't, you know, let's call it a disaster. The people who do a lot of different theories, people were trying to figure out what to do. And about 40 years ago, people like John Gottman and others decided we're looking in the wrong place. Let's look at the good marriages, not just the bad marriages. We're trying to figure out what the bad marriages are doing wrong. Let's see what the good marriages are doing right. And what they found was very fascinating. The comparison between the good marriages and the bad marriage, a lot of couples therapy is based on that. And a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is based on that research. So let's get started. But before I go into the good marriage, bad marriage comparison, I just want to throw out some fundamentals of marriage. A lot of what we think about marriage is a lot of what really makes marriage work is not intuitive. So if you grew up in a home where you saw a good marriage, you know, you're ahead of the game. But if you didn't see a good marriage, it's really not intuitive. So I'm gonna do some screen sharing to try to get some slides on. If anybody wants these slides afterwards, they're available. But here's the first slide. Marriage is inherently unstable. That's something that comes to many people as a surprise. A couple's natural tendency is to drift apart. This makes it different than almost every other relationship. And what I mean by that is, when I say marriage is inherently unstable, every other relationship, think of a friendship, think of a sibling relationship. If I did not speak to my brother or my sister or my cousin for the last 3 weeks, and I meet them in an hour from now, the relationship will be exactly where it was 3 weeks ago. If left off over here, if we were this close, we'll be this close now. If there's a good friend that I haven't seen in 6 months, so when I meet him, we were this far apart 6 months ago, that's exactly where we are now. If I didn't see my wife in 2 hours, the relationship starts to drift apart. It's an inherently unstable relationship. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which we're not going to talk about now. But what that means is that every single interaction in a marriage counts. If I walk into the kitchen and I see my wife and I say hi to her with a smile, the relationship just got a little bit closer. If I walk in and I frown, the relationship just got further apart. No other relationship works like that as much as a marriage does. Every other relationship could handle ups and downs without really moving too much. Marriage moves very quickly in and out in terms of the relationship. And what that means, just on a practical level, what that means is that in marriage, every moment counts. If I said I love you last night, I have to say I love you again this morning. There's an inherent instability that we always have to be cognizant of. The next slide is people, you know, it's kind of funny, but let me see 1 second. Okay, what's the difference between business and marriage? And this is important because the way we perceive relationships is very, very, very different in marriage than it works in so many other places in the world. In business, the behavior is primary and the reason for the behavior is secondary. In marriage, the behavior is secondary and the reason for the behavior is primary. Let me explain to you what that means. What that means is, very often I'll get in a session in my office, I'll get a question of, if I asked my wife to do this, or I asked my husband to do this, and they forgot. If his boss had asked him, or her boss had asked her, they never would have forgotten. And that may be true. That's true. So what is it about? So yeah, I mean, well, your boss is more important than me. And the answer to that is, in business, every relationship has two components to it. There's the process of that relationship, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, the process of the relationship and the content of that relationship. The content is what we're talking about, and the process is how we're talking to each other. In business, so let me give you an example. If let's say I ask my wife to come visit me I make up with my wife, we're gonna meet at 9 o'clock. And for me, 9 o'clock means 9 o'clock. And she shows up at 9:15. And she has a really good excuse. And the next day she shows up at 9:20. And the next day she shows up at 9:05. Next day it's 9:30. If this were an employee, after a certain period of time, that's enough. That's it. We're done. If this is my wife or my husband, it's not about in work. The reason for the behavior is secondary. Primary is you have to be there at 9 o'clock. Why weren't you there at 9 o'clock? It might have been a really good reason. You may have had really good reasons why you weren't there at 9 o'clock, but after a while, it's irrelevant. The behavior is primary. In marriage, the reason why you weren't there at 9 o'clock is primary. That is what is most important. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that later. One other thing about marriage is that marriage is a commitment. Friendships are not a commitment. Commitment means that we assume the relationship will be challenged. Otherwise, why commit? What is when we say commitment, we're committing to somebody for life. Inherent in that is the idea that this is going to be challenged. We're going to have trouble. We're going to have things that we really, really need to work through. And it's just really important to always remember that inside of a marriage. One other thing before I start, I want to get to the list of what's happening in a good marriage, what's happening in a bad marriage. But one thing I just want to say before we start, everything that I'm going to be talking about tonight assumes that there is no mental illness in the marriage, no personality disorders in the marriage, no severe trauma in marriage. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to present you with a list. This is what a good marriage looks like. This is what a bad marriage looks like. And what if you can't get there? Because I'm not going to give you the skills of getting it. I'm going to show you what it looks like, just so you see that this is where I'm headed. This is, if you want to go to Chicago, you need to know where Chicago is. If you want to have a good marriage, you need to know where that is and what it looks like. What if it's impossible to get there? Either you yourself feel, I just can't do that. I see what he's saying, but there's no way I can behave like that, or I can do stuff like that. Or my spouse can't do that. Then you need help. So whatever I'm saying here, just keep that in mind. And if you need help, always, of course, get help. Never hesitate, because look at this as a sort of, how do you know when your marriage needs help? So if you can't get to this, if what we're going to present tonight is inaccessible, then it's a marriage that needs help. Okay, so what we're going to do, it's going to look like this. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of screens with two sides. One is going to say in a problematic marriage, one is going to say in a happy marriage, and we're going to kind of see. Let's go into their kitchens. Let's go into their bedrooms. Let's see what the good marriages look like. Let's see what the problematic marriages look like. So here we are. In a problematic marriage, I know exactly who you are. And in a happy marriage, I always remain curious about who you are. Now, maybe you expected that to be the opposite. In a problematic marriage, we know our spouse. The curiosity is gone. It's like I once had a woman say to me in my office, you know, I'm married to him for 20 years. Don't tell me what he's thinking. I'll tell you what he's thinking. If I know you, there's no room for exploration. There's no room for curiosity. And what happens is the following. Okay? In a problematic marriage, we say things like, we know each other so well. We're like one person. We can read each other's minds. We finish each other's sentences. If you're in a relationship like that, look out. Because you know each other so well until you don't. You're like one person until you're not. You can read each other's minds until you can't do that anymore. In a happy marriage, we don't know each other. We're two very different people. And I really have no idea what my spouse is thinking. And that's going to be, we're going to play with that a lot as we move along, because that's a really fundamental component of a good marriage and a bad marriage. There's a concept of subjective reality that John Gottman says is probably one of the single most important aspects of a good marriage. Subjective reality means that, as opposed to objective reality, means that my reality is subjective. My reality is my reality, and your reality may be completely different. It may look completely different. We don't know each other. So in a problematic marriage, an extension of that is, in a problematic marriage, you should know what I need without me telling you. And in a happy marriage, I need to tell you what I need, or you won't know. One of the things I think, from my experience, what I've seen that destroys marriages more than anything else is that line. You should know what I need. How come you don't know? Isn't that basic? Isn't that obvious? You know, you walked into the kitchen, or I was walking into the house and I was holding the shopping bags, and you didn't know that you needed me to take it. And the answer is probably you didn't. You need me to tell you. Or you go into the car, you see the gas tank is almost like by empty, and you need me to tell you these things. In a happy marriage, what you'll notice, and this is when there was research done. I mentioned this research up front, where they compared happy marriages and bad marriages. What they actually did was they put couples. John Gottman did this and others, but mainly John Gottman. When he put couples in rooms, like he gave them an apartment with a camera, and paid them just to live in the apartment for a week, and they had a team of psychologists watching them. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is what they were noticing. And they were watching these couples talk to each other in the happy marriages and the bad marriage, and this is what they were doing. So in a problematic marriage, there was this, after a couple of hours, people forget that there's a camera watching them, and they just act the way they always act. And what they were saying is, in a problematic marriage, people were saying, there was an expectation that you will know what I need without me telling you. In a happy marriage, it's I need to tell you what I need. And notice the counterintuitive aspects of this. You would think in a happy marriage, we just kind of know each other. We just kind of, there's just this knowing. And the truth is, on planet Earth, that generally doesn't exist. Maybe after 40, 50 years, you'll get to that place of you know what I need without me telling you. But it might take 40, 50 years to get there. And if you think about it, there's a certain respect in this also. I might need things that you don't know what I need. And you might need something totally different. Maybe your needs are completely different than my needs. And can we respect that? Another aspect of that is, let's go to the next screen. And this flows from the idea of we are completely different. In a problematic marriage, we fight over what happened. And in a happy marriage, we accept that we may never agree about what happened. What does that mean? It means I come home, my husband walks into the house at 7 o'clock. and his wife has a fit because you told me you were coming home at 6. And he looks at her and says, I told you I was coming home at 7. So no, you said you were coming home at 6. Who's right? Who's wrong? What really happened? And we may never know. We may never know. And as a matter of fact, even if we had a camera with an audio watching the conversation where he said 6 or 7, we still may never know. Because what he thought was 6, she thought was 7. What he thought was 7, she thought was 6. In a problematic marriage, the fight at that point is, did you say 6 or did you say 7? And they will never agree on that. For the rest of their life, they will never agree on that. In a happy marriage, there's an acceptance that we may never agree about what happened. If you think about in terms of what I just described, if the husband, how do you resolve a fight like that? Now she's fuming mad. He's fuming mad at her because she's mad at him for no reason. And there's just anger at each other. How do you resolve this kind of fight? How do you recover from a fight like that? And I'm using a silly example, but it's not so silly because this can grow into much bigger things. But the mechanics of it is the same. If the fact that you thought that I said 7 is an issue, and we have to fight about that, this fight is not resolvable. But what if, in the course of our arguing with each other, it turns out that I thought I said 6. I thought you said 6. No, I thought I said 7. Once we know that, means you were really living in this world where you thought, your universe, you thought you said 7. And you were living in a world where you thought you said 6. Where you thought I said 6. Once we know that, really the fight is over. Really, there is no fight anymore at that point. Because, you thought I said 6. I got it. Okay. And I thought you thought you said 7. I got it. Okay. There's no fight at that point. If there's a trust, which we'll talk about also, if there's a trust in that relationship, and we know that our spouse is not a pathological liar. I really thought I said 7. I really thought you said 6. At that point, the fight is over. And that's what happens. It's like, oh, you meant that. Oh, you meant that. Another part of this is in a problematic marriage, we fight about who's right and who's wrong. And in a happy marriage, we talk about how we each feel and what we need from each other. And just hold on to that thing on the bottom. Underneath that, it says 69% of all marital disagreements are unresolvable. That's a very, very important statistic. It comes out of John Gottman's research. 69% of all marital disagreements are unresolvable. What does that mean? So instead of 69, I'm just going to say 70. It's easier to say. If a couple is fighting about something, they just completely disagree about something, and they're in their 20s, there is a 70% chance, and it might be something about politics. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican. There might be something about ethics. It might be something about, about marriage. There is a 70% chance. Now, they're 22 years old, they're 25 years old, they're fighting about this. They vehemently disagree. 70% chance that when they're in their 80s and when they're in their 90s, they will still disagree. 7 out of 10 disagreements never get resolved. Now hold on, think about that for a minute, because what that means is when you're arguing about who's right or who's wrong, there's a 30% chance that you'll convince your spouse, 70% chance you will never convince your spouse. Think about that the next time you get into a fight about who's right and who's wrong, about an issue. In a happy marriage, we talk about, if you watch the couples in happy marriages talk about things where they vehemently disagree, they may be trying to convince each other. Why not? There's a 30% chance you'll convince your spouse. But they're holding on to that 70% that they will not convince. And they talk about how they feel and what we need from each other. If one spouse needs the window open because it's hot and the other spouse needs the window closed because it's freezing, okay, that's not resolvable. It will never be resolved. So what do? You can fight about about who's right and who it's cold. No, it's hot. No, it's cold. That's going nowhere. What about we talk about how we each feel and what we need from each other? What can we do? How can we make this work? Now, I'm going to give you an example. Again, I'm going to give you, let's call it a silly example, but maybe not. One of my favorite examples from a couple that I once worked with is if you're waiting online, they're waiting online in the supermarket. And there's, you know, they had, the husband and wife were there, they had the carriage piled high with stuff. And somebody walks over with 2 items and says, do you mind if I'm in a rush, do you mind if I run ahead of you? And the husband looks at him and says, yeah, I'm also in a rush. And the wife was horrified. She wanted to dig a hole and go right into the hole right there. And they come into my office fighting about this. What's the matter with him? And he's just a cruel person. And what's the matter with her? She just lets people step all over them, or step all over her. Now, who's right and who's wrong? So what I told them, which is what I would tell many couples in situations, I have my opinion, you have your opinion, and you have your opinion. And one thing we can argue about who's right or who's wrong, but one thing I know is that when you're 95 years old, you'll still be arguing about this. You still will disagree. And when your great-grandchildren come and ask you, do you let somebody in front of you online, you'll still be giving them different answers. So get used to it. But now what do? Now it's a different conversation. Now they can have a different conversation. Now it's not about fighting over who's right or who's wrong. They can still fight over who's right or who's wrong. Over a cup of coffee in Starbucks, they can go on for years arguing about this. But in terms of the marriage, all they need to do is accept the fact that we will never convince each other. So now what do? And what this particular couple did was, the conversation became not about who's right or who's wrong, but about feelings. How do we feel and what we need from each other? So she was talking about how embarrassed she was. You know, the person that came over was her child's teacher or something. And he was talking about how he feels like a shmata. And he feels like, people could step all over me. And when that conversation continues, you'll find it going into his childhood and her childhood and his feeling that people can step all over him and her feeling embarrassed, where that comes from. It's a meaningful conversation. And with this particular couple, where that conversation went was, he said, he finally got to a point where he said, you know what, when I'm with you in the supermarket, I will let people go ahead of me because I don't want you to be embarrassed. Not because I'm wrong and not because you're right, but I don't want you to be embarrassed. You're my wife, I love you. But when I'm alone, I'll do what I want. And they were okay with that, and that works, and that's a happy marriage. So that's what I mean by, in a problematic marriage, we fight over who's right and who's wrong. And in a happy marriage, we talk about how we feel and what we need from each other. Okay, in a problematic marriage, one of the most important lines in a marriage, you'll find me saying a lot tonight, things like what most important, or this is the most important thing in marriage. They're all true. There's about 100 things that are the most important thing in a marriage. So this is another one of them. The ability to say, I am so sorry, but it's not what I meant. I just said something really hurtful, and can we recover from that? Something really hurtful took place between us. Is there enough trust in the marriage for me to be able to say, I'm really sorry, but I meant what you thought I meant, I didn't mean. Most fights in a marriage can be over very quickly, in 2 minutes, if the ability to say that is there. And in a problematic marriage, one of the biggest problems in problematic marriages is the ability to do that is not there. So that's not what I meant. The response to that in a problematic marriage might be, how could that not be what you meant? But that doesn't make any sense. And in a happy marriage, there's an acceptance of that. When two people live together 24/7, 365, for year after year after year, things are going to be said. Hurtful things are going to be said. Is there an ability to recover from that? And the ability to recover from that is in these words. These are one of the most important words in a marriage. The ability to say, I'm really sorry, that's not what I meant. if you look at these two boxes, can you see the difference between the two? In a problematic marriage, we say, why did you do that? And in a happy marriage, we ask, why did you do that? What does that mean? The question, why did you do that, is not always a question. Very often it's an accusation. I'm sitting by my mother-in-law's house with my wife, and I'm sitting by my in-laws with my wife, and she makes a comment about me. Or maybe she ignores me. Maybe she's busy with her siblings and just ignoring me. And afterwards, when later on, we're in the car and we're driving home, I say to her, why did you do that? What's the matter? Why did you do that? That's not a question. There's no question of that. There's an exclamation point at the end of that. In a problematic marriage, when one spouse does something that the other spouse doesn't like, the statement is, why did you do that? In a happy marriage, when one spouse does something that the other spouse doesn't like, the question is, why did you do that? So the same words might be in the happy marriage after the same event. You know, we were by your parents, and you were just talking to your siblings, and you were completely ignoring me the whole time. I just felt so ignored. Why did you do that? Like, what was going on? There's a curiosity in that. I really want to know. In happy marriages, when we ask our spouse, why did you do that? It's a real question. I really, really want to know. I want to understand you. There's an exploration. And again, this goes back to the first thing that we said. In a happy marriage, we don't know each other. And in a problematic marriage, we know each other, or at least we think we do. If I know you, then I know exactly why you did that. You did that because you don't care about me. You did that because you like your brother more than you like me. You did that because you just get so caught up with what's happening. I know exactly why you did that. And in a happy marriage, you'll find the couple saying, no, why did you do that? Like, what went on? And I really want to know the answer. And usually there's a really nice conversation that ensues after that. Again, these things were, you know, when Gottman was doing his research and watching the couples in rooms, watching the happy couples, watching the miserable couples, watching what they did, this is the way they talked. Okay, the next thing we're going to go to is the concept of criticism in a marriage. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the concept of the four horsemen. We're going to go through Gottman's four horsemen. John Gottman has 4 behaviors that he says are predictive of divorce. And I'm just going to go through the 4 now. The first one is criticism. In a problematic marriage, there is criticism of what you did wrong, whereas in a happy marriage, there's an expression of my perspective, my needs, and my feelings. And I'll show you why those are opposites. Criticism versus an expression of my perspective. If you think about it, almost anything that can be expressed as a criticism can also be expressed as a need. My wife or my husband just did something that I think is, was hurtful. Let me give you a totally different example. Let's say I'm in a hallway. I'm walking down a hallway, and there's somebody sitting there with his feet spread out across the hallway. It's a public hallway, and he's sitting there with his feet spread out. His foot is halfway across the hallway, and I didn't see him. So I walk and I step on his foot. And when I step on his foot, he goes, ouch. He goes, ow, ow. And he's in pain. I turn around, I see he's in pain. I see I stepped on him, and I really feel bad. So I turn to him and I say, oh, are you okay? I'm so sorry. I apologize for what I did. I wanted to, see if I can get something for him, because all he said was ouch. He expressed pain for what I did. What if instead of saying ouch, he starts yelling at me, or he starts criticizing me? He says, what's the matter? You don't see where you're going? Are you blind? You need a pair of glasses? You go just step on people's feet? Guess what's going to happen? I'm going to become very defensive, because this is a public hallway. And I may, instead of going, are you okay? I'm so sorry. I may turn to him and say, excuse me, but you own this hallway? I mean, you can put your feet wherever you want. I don't have to watch to make sure everybody, and now we're in a fight. If I see my husband doing something wrong, or if my husband or my wife does something that hurts me, or that's something that bothers me, and I criticize it, I'm telling them what they did wrong. Criticism means you. Any sentence that starts with you is usually a criticism. Any sentence that starts with me, I, is usually an expression of my feelings. So I didn't like, maybe you came home late from work today. You came home really late. I thought you were coming home early. You promised me the last 3 days that you're going to come home early. And I start the sentence with you. It might be, you're always coming home late from work. That's a criticism. What's the opposite? How do you do that? I just said before, almost anything that can be expressed as a criticism can also be expressed as a need. So how would that work here? If you watch the couples in problematic marriages, they criticize. So the husband comes home late from work, or the wife comes home late from work, and the response is, you're always coming home late from work. That's a criticism. It's probably going to be met with a defensiveness. It's probably going to be, something to answer. You just criticized me. I need to defend myself. And if you go into the happy marriage, you go into their kitchen and watch what's happening there. The husband walks in an hour late from work. The wife might say something like, "It's really hard for me when you come home so late." No criticism. It's really hard for me when you come home so late. There's a discussion. Now, the husband's response might be about how hard it is for him to come home early. But he's not responding to a criticism. There's a conversation now. There's a conversation about two people that have maybe differing needs and talking about those needs. Again, when they watch the couples in happy marriages and miserable marriages, this is one of the major differences that they saw. The conversation was about what you did wrong, as opposed to a conversation about what I need, what my perspectives are. So that's criticism is the first of John Gottman's four horsemen. Here's the second one. Second one is defensiveness, because that's really the opposite of criticism. In defensiveness means you just said something. You may have even said, you may not have criticized. You may have said, "It's really hard for me when you come home so late." So I could go into defensive mode. In defensive mode would mean that I start telling you there's nothing wrong with coming home so late, and everybody comes home so late, and what do you think? I have to make a living, I have to put food on the table. Whoa, I just said it's really hard for me when you come home so late, and you go into this defensive mode. The opposite of defensive mode would be an openness to hearing another perspective and talking about it and saying, I get it. It's really hard for you when you come home, when I come home so late. And maybe explaining what makes it hard for me to come home early, or talking about how we can arrange things so that I can come home early. But there's a conversation instead of just defensiveness. Communication is mostly about being able to listen even when I have so much to say. That's the opposite. Defensiveness means you just said something that I have so many answers to what you just said. There's so many reasons why I need to come home the time that I come home. I can really give it to you. Or I could stop, press pause, and really just listen. Listen to what you're saying. A lot of couples come into therapy with communication skills. So, with communication skills issues, meaning they come in and say, we want to learn how to communicate. They know how to communicate. If communication is talking, they know how to talk. They know how to say what they want. They know how to yell. They can be very articulate. Communication really is mostly about being able to listen, even when I have so much to say. That right there is 90% of communication skills. And again, you'll find that if you look at the good marriages, the bad marriages, there's a lot more listening happening. And in the bad marriages, there's a lot more talking happening. So that criticism and defensiveness were two of Gottman's four horsemen. He says these are the four things that predict, and he actually says predict divorce if it has all four. The next two are what's called contempt and stonewalling. Contempt is, a roll of the eye. Contempt is when I answer you back without answering you back, just to either make fun of you. It's a contemptuous response. I'll roll my eyes. I'll go, yeah, right, whatever. That's contempt. in an argument in a marriage, when it goes to contempt, the argument is over. There are three ways, really, to end an argument. One way to end, there are three ways, I'm sorry, there are three ways to respond to an argument. One way is to continue the argument. I said, you know, a good argument with a husband and wife is like a good ping pong game. You have two people who know how to play ping pong. The ball goes back and forth, or tennis, the ball goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth many times. That's a good argument. In problematic marriages, the arguments end. And there's two reasons why they end. One is what's called contempt, which I just described. The other is what's called stonewalling. And stonewalling is, I just shut down. And in a good marriage, you'll find that these two things are absent. There's no contempt, there's no stonewalling. What brings about it? Just to say to somebody, so don't do contempt and don't do stonewalling, that doesn't work. Because contempt and stonewalling are there for a reason. And they're ways of calming intense emotions. So it's an important thing to understand. If we're having an argument and I all of a sudden get completely overwhelmed, I need to deal with my overwhelmness. I need to deal with what's happening inside of me. There's a fascinating studies actually, many, that equate being emotionally overwhelmed to being physically overwhelmed. I'm sure most of you are familiar with fight or flight mode. If a lion comes into, if I'm face to face with a lion or a wild dog, the body goes in, you know, this is the deer in the headlights syndrome. We this fight, flight, or freeze. When we are face to face with danger, the body goes into fight or flight mode. Well, fight or flight mode means, they've actually studied this with fMRIs, you know, these brain scans where they study different sections of the brain. When I am faced with an imminent danger, what happens inside my brain is that the decision-making part of my brain, the part of my brain that has judgment, that makes clear decisions, goes offline completely. If I'm face to face with a lion, the whole decision-making center of my brain is gone. And I function from a place of very primitive place inside of me. And I'm going to act without thinking. And that's a survival tool. If I have to think, if there's a lion coming at me and I have to think, I'm dead. If I can act without thinking, if I can act just spontaneously, impulsively, I have a chance at survival. So literally in the fMRI machines, they watch neuroscience research, they see that the decision-making center, the prefrontal cortex, goes completely offline, and we function from a very, very primitive place. There's no thought. What they found is when people get emotionally overwhelmed, the brain does the same thing. And the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making center of the brain, the part of the brain that's involved in judgment, goes completely offline, and they act from an impulsive place. Think of what this means when a husband and wife are facing each other, and all of a sudden, they each get, or one of them gets emotionally overwhelmed, and the decision-making, the judgment portion of their brain goes offline. They'll say things, words come out that are beyond belief, and there's no controlling it. Contempt, and the reason why this has to do with contempt and stonewalling are ways of escaping that. Sometimes people go to contempt or stonewalling, they'll move away because it's the only way. I've heard people say this so many times, if I don't roll my eyes or I don't walk out of the room, I'm just going to yell and say the stupidest things that I could never take back. So contempt and stonewalling are obviously, they're very valuable tools in a marriage, but we have to be, it's important to know where they come from. And sometimes sometimes these are things that we just need help with. If I can't help it but be contemptuous, if I can't help it but stonewall, or if I can't help it but yell, that's something that the marriage just needs help, right, in those places. The next thing I'm going to go to is, this is, I guess, pretty obvious, but let's do it anyway. In a problematic marriage, expectations dominate. In a happy marriage, acceptance dominates. There's just a mood in a happy marriage of just an acceptance of what's there. You know, not everything becomes an issue that we really need to address. It's just, okay, yeah, that's my husband, that's my wife, haha, it becomes okay. And that leads right into the next screen, into the next slide that I have, which is the concept of negative sentiment and positive sentiment. Again, I said there were a whole bunch of things that were the most important thing in a marriage. This is another one. In a problematic marriage, there's an overriding negative sentiment, and in a happy marriage, there's an overriding positive sentiment. By sentiment, we mean just the general mood between us. And in order to maintain a positive sentiment in the marriage, there has to be at least a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative. Here's what that means. Again, the positive mood in the marriage. Let's talk about what are we talking about by positive sentiment, negative sentiment. So I had a couple, not in my office. I actually had them in my dining room, where one spouse was the wife was talking about her husband. Husband is a very forgetful person, a wonderful, wonderful person, but very forgetful. And the wife was telling me that she was telling us that her husband, every morning she puts the garbage, and she asks her husband to take out the garbage when he leaves. He leaves the house at 5 o'clock, please take out, and he always forgets. He always forgets. So she told us that one morning she took the garbage, she put it in front of the door where he walks out, just the door that he has to walk out. So there's no way, the only way that he'll be able to get out of that door is if he pushes the garbage aside. And she figured, okay, this way he won't forget. So she schlepped the garbage, put it in front of the door, went to sleep. The next morning she wakes up and she sees the garbage was pushed aside and he had gone out of the house without taking the garbage. And when she told us this story, she was laughing. She thought it was so funny. She thought it was so cute. That's a positive sentiment. That's positive sentiment in the marriage. When there's positive sentiment in a marriage, when there's just this feeling between the two of you, you can almost do no wrong. And when there's negative sentiment, you can almost do no right. If there's negative sentiment in the marriage and I forget to take out the garbage, and I take out the garbage, if there's positive sentiment and I forget to take out the garbage, no big deal. But if there's negative sentiment and I remember to take out the garbage, it's, well, how come you took out the garbage, but you forgot to take the garbage from the bathroom? Why you never do it right? That's what happens when there's negative sentiment. So how do you get to positive sentiment? So great, let's have positive sentiment in the marriage. The more positivity there is, obviously, the more positive the sentiment. But how does that work? What has come out of Gottman's research is they found is that in order to maintain a positive sentiment in marriage, it has to be a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative. In other words, let's say for every one negative interaction in our marriage, negative interaction means anything negative. I make a negative remark, or even if I go, that's negative. That's a negative interaction. Let's say, and a positive interaction would be hi, a smile, I love you, you look beautiful today, thank you so much. That's a positive interaction. Let's say for every negative interaction in our marriage, there are 4 positive interactions. What will the sentiment be in our marriage? And the answer is, with a 4-to-1, positive to negative, 4-to-1 positive, we will have a negative sentiment in our marriage. You need at least 5-to-1 to get it to get a marriage to a place of positive sentiment. And you need 20-to-1 to really solidify it. What that means is, think about the ramifications of this. If 20 times today I said something nice to my wife said something nice to me, 20 times we were just saying nice things. I walk into the kitchen and I smiled, check, positive. My wife came to my office and she smiled. She said something nice. I said something nice to her. There was just nice stuff going on between us. 20 times, 20 interactions. And then I do something really stupid. It's 20-to-1. That one thing that I did is taking place inside the context of a really positive sentiment. It'll go unnoticed. It'll just go unnoticed. If all I had was 4 positive interactions, that one thing I did can be devastating. We may end up fighting about it for 3 days. So just in terms of the basic ramifications of this, we need to get as many things in the happy marriages. They're just piling up stuff in the positive interaction category, and that's a major reason why the marriage is negative. Gottman found that this is probably one of the most basic differences between the happy marriage and a problematic marriage. is just the sentiment. They can fight about the same things, but the sentiment is negative, or the sentiment is positive. Let's just move to the next one. Okay. Just pardon my technical inabilities over here. Here we go. Okay, in a problematic marriage, we only have conversations that we need to have. And in a happy marriage, we always have conversations that we do not need to have. Okay, now we're switching gears a little bit. Now we're not, up until now we were talking about things that, well, okay, we're gonna switch gears a drop and move into a different category. Conversations that we need to have, conversations that we do not need to have. The most meaningful friendships are often built on the most meaningless conversations. What do we mean by a conversation that we need to have or a conversation that we do not need to have? In a problematic marriage, in any marriage, there are tons and tons and tons of conversations that we need to have. The kids, the laundry, the finances, the in-laws. There's so much stuff that has to be talked about. Think about what happens when a couple is dating. All the conversations that they have are conversations that they do not need to have. The conversations we need to have are the important ones. The conversations we don't need to have are the silly ones, the meaningless ones, the fun ones. Oh, how was your day? Conversations, politics conversations, you know, a book we read, let's talk about that. Conversations that if we didn't have this conversation, it really wouldn't make a difference in our life. And we're having those conversations. If you think about it, the most meaningful relationships in our lives, think about high school friendships. Where were these friendships built? Where were they? Where did they were not built on agenda conversations. They weren't built on conversations that we needed to have. Most friendships, most deep, meaningful friendships are built on conversations that we do not need to have. And there's something very, very sad about what happens in a marriage. We date, we get to know each other really well, and then we get married. But how did we get to know each other really well? Most of the conversations on a date, think about this, probably 90% of the conversations on date are conversations that we do not need to have. We just talk about stuff. And we don't need to have these conversations because I'm going home to my house, you're going home to your house, and there's not much that we have in common. And that's how the relationship was built. It was built on meaningless conversations. And then we get married, and the very thing that created the friendship, the very thing that made us want to get married is gone from the relationship. The very thing that made our relationship so beautiful is gone. We don't do it anymore. Now we're having a completely different kind of conversations. In happy marriages, we continue to date. We continue to talk about those things that we don't have to talk about. And that brings us to the next slide, which is in a happy marriage, in a problematic marriage, dating is a thing of the past. In a happy marriage, we never stop dating. We're going to constantly talk about the things that we don't have to talk about. And that builds a friend. You cannot build a friendship talking just about things that are important. There's one other, if you look at the last line on that slide, there's one other thing I want to talk about dating. Is the two things that stand out most in our mind when we date is to be curious and to be nice. Think about this. A couple is on a date. I mentioned before that in every conversation, there are two things that take place, the content and the process. The process is how we're talking. The content is what we're talking about. On a date, the process is way more important than the content. What we're talking about is important, but it's not as important as how we're talking. We need to be nice and we need to be curious. I want to know who this guy is. I want to know who this girl is. We need to be nice and curious. In a marriage, for many obvious reasons, but sadly in a marriage, that switches. All of a sudden the content becomes the most important thing. If on a date, we're talking about whether the window, you know, the girl says, you know, I like it when it's nice and warm in the bedroom and the window closed. And the guy says, no, I like it when it's freezing and I like the window open. And they could look at each other and smile and laugh about it. You like it cold or you like it hot. And it's you know, it's a fun conversation. And he goes home to his freezing bedroom and she goes home to her boiling hot bedroom and everybody's happy. And then they get married. When they were dating, the process was the most important. We need to be friendly with each other. We need to be curious about each other. And she might even ask him, like, why do you like the window open? Why do you like the window closed? Really? You like it when it's cold? Really? And they're curious, they're interested in each other. Then they get married. And it's the process becomes irrelevant. It's all about the content. I need that window closed. I need that window open. Now, I'm picking a silly example, window open, window closed, but you can project this onto so many conversations, so many important conversations that take place in the marriage. And when and if you think about it, any conversation, if we're arguing about where we're going for the weekend, are we going to your parents or my parents? Are we going to, there's a simcha in your family or there's a simcha in my family? Where are we going? That's the content is very important. Or which schools should we send our kids to? There are really important conversations we have over here. Are we having those conversations from a place of, are we really focused on the process? Are we focused, or has the content become more important than anything else? If you think about it, what's the most important thing in any conversation that a husband and wife have? Any conversation that a husband and wife have, what's the single most important thing in that conversation? The single most important thing in that conversation is, what is our marriage going to look like after this conversation? If we're arguing about which school to send our kids to, if we're arguing about where we go for the weekend, what's the single most important outcome of that conversation? It's not about where we go to weekend. It's not even about which school we send our kids to. The single most important outcome of that conversation is, what is our marriage going to look like for the next 50 years? Are we ready to destroy our marriage because of this particular decision? The process, and it's what switches in dating. It's very sad, but dating, what happened? I've worked with couples that have dated for a year and a half, and then got married, and we're in my office 3 months after the wedding, fighting like anything. Because the dating process is a process of curiosity and being nice, and all of a sudden, and they're very focused on their process, and all of a sudden they get married, and it's all about the content. Okay, I'm going to switch gears again. In a problematic marriage, and Naftali, you want to keep me focused on time. I have no idea what the. In a problematic marriage, we turn away from our spouse's bits for connection, and in a happy marriage, we turn towards our spouse's bits for connection. Let me tell you about the concept of bits for connection. If you've read anything by John Gottman, you'll see that. Concept of a bit for connection is that whenever in a marriage, most requests for attention are not about we talked about content and process. They're not about the content, they're about the process. So for example, let's say I'm sitting in the kitchen reading my email, and my wife is standing by the window of the kitchen, and she points out the window and says, well, isn't that a nice bird out there? I never saw a bird like that. And I'm really interested in the email right now, and maybe I'm not so interested in the bird. But is it about the bird? Because if it's about the bird, then I'm really focused on the content. And what Gottman found was that it's not about the bird. And if you think about it, it's so obvious. It's about a bid for connection. I want to connect with you. This is, can you join me in this? I'm appreciating something outside my window, and I want to join with you. It's a bid for connection. And if I see it as a bid for connection, I may not be that excited about the bird, but I am excited about my wife. And if she wants to connect, I want to connect. And after a while, I may learn to love birds because my wife loves birds. And then at the same time, I might be looking at my phone and looking at the news, and I might, my wife is busy looking at the bird, and I say, wow, did you see what Trump said today? And maybe she doesn't care what Trump said today, but she cares about me. So she'll turn around and say, yeah, well, what did he say? Bits for when we in a problematic marriage and a happy marriage, bits for connection there's a very big difference in how they're responded to. This is another one of those things that's the most important in a marriage, and they really found this. There are 3 ways to respond to a bid, and we're not even going to talk about the third way. The third way is leave me alone, don't bother me. That's called turning against the bid. That's an obviously bad marriage, but the two more benign ways, turning towards a bid, let's use the example of my wife said there's a really nice bird out the window. Turning towards the bid would be getting up and looking and saying, oh, wow, that's really nice. I never saw that before. Then there's something called, another response to a bid. It might not be turning towards, it's just turning away. I mean, I'm looking at my phone right now and I go, yeah, without taking my eye off my phone. That's turning away. And they found this when they were looking at, this is one of the things that showed up the most when Gottman was looking at these couples in these rooms that he had, that the couples in the happy marriages were turning towards the bids, and the couples in the problematic marriages were just going, And that dynamic itself may have accounted for 90% of the difference in the marriage. In other words, everything else being equal, that kind of, the whole marriage hinged on that. So that's, and remember, it's not about we have to be interested in the same things. It's more about we have to be interested in each other. And that the next slide is really a continuation of that in a certain way. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Gary Chapman's concept of love languages. In a problematic marriage, I express and receive love in a way that is meaningful to myself. And in a happy marriage, I express and receive love in a way that is meaningful to you. In other words, human beings have different ways of expressing and receiving love. There are more than 5, but Gary Chapman expresses 5 of them in his book. It's called the 5 Love Languages. Touch, words, acts of service, quality time, and gifts. You know, if I like vanilla ice cream and you like chocolate ice cream, and I keep on buying vanilla ice cream because I like it, that's not going to make a very good relationship. I need to go out and find out what flavor ice cream you like and get that for you. So if you like chocolate and I like vanilla, showing love would be getting you chocolate ice cream. So what does it mean to say I love you? How do you express love? How do you express it, and how do you receive it? And what I found is it's different for different people. For some people, saying I love you is the single most important thing. I need to hear the words. Words are critical. For some people, words mean nothing. It's not about saying I love you. It's, are you spending time with me? If you're spending time with me, then I know you love me. You could say I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, but you're not spending any quality time with me. And for some people, it's acts of service, what Chapman calls acts of service, which is, what are you doing for me? You know, you said you love me, you're spending time with me, but I asked you to take out the garbage 10 times, you didn't take out the garbage. And for some people, touch is critical. Saying I love you doesn't work. But it's physical touch. Physical touch is what says I love you. And for some people, it's gifts. Gifts means I was somewhere and I thought about you where I was. I was in the supermarket and I saw the tomatoes that you love. So I got that tomato. Like I saw the apple that you love. That's a gift. Now imagine you have a couple with different love languages. This is what Chapman calls love language. Imagine you have one spouse who touch means everything, and the other spouse, words means everything. So you keep saying I love you, but when was the last time you gave me a hug? And if the other spouse is you hug me, you kiss me, but when was the last time you said I love you? And what's very important with love languages is, if I get the language that is really, really important to me, if I get the love language that's really important to me, I can accept everything else. If I don't get what's important to me, if let's say words is the most important thing to me. let's say touch is the most important thing to me. And by the way, this works with kids also. It's just as an aside. If you have a daughter, let's say, who touch is her love language, and you just keep doing stuff for her. You make her lunch, you do her carpool, you do this, you do that, you spend quality time for her, you get her gifts, you say I love you. She just wants a hug and a kiss. She'll reject everything else because she's not getting the love language she wants. Now bring that back to a marriage. That's what happens in a marriage. If quality time is the most important thing for me in terms of love language. And you give me everything. You give me gifts. You do acts of service. You say I love you, but you're not giving me quality time. I'll reject everything else. How do you know what your spouse's love language is? How do I know if my love language is quality time and my spouse's love language is words? How do I know? And the answer is you don't, unless you talk to each other. And in a happy marriage, we're curious. What means love to you? And we're there for each other. I don't like vanilla ice cream, but if you like it, that's what I'm going to get for you. We're going to just move on to another screen. Okay. Here we go. In a problematic marriage, different topic. Hurt feelings are expressed as anger. In a happy marriage, hurt feelings are expressed as hurt feelings. If I can't fully express my emotional pain, it will often come out as anger. In a happy marriage, in marriage, period, people are always getting hurt. Again, I said that before. You cannot live with somebody 24/7, 365 for your entire life and not hurt each other. You will hurt each other. So hurt feelings have to be expressed. In a problematic marriage, hurt feelings are expressed as anger. If you think about it, whenever you see somebody angry, most of the time there's hurt right behind that anger. Let's say you call me stupid and I get angry at you. In between you calling me stupid and me getting angry at you is me getting hurt. But instead of me saying, that was really hurtful, you said something really not nice about me, that was really hurtful. I'm not saying that. That's too vulnerable. So instead I get angry at you. In a happy marriage, we're vulnerable enough. We allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to express hurt feelings as hurt feelings. And very often in couples therapy, sometimes the transition from a problematic marriage to a happy marriage is when the couple, instead of being angry at each other, is able to express hurt to each other. It can make the whole difference. When you express anger, you push somebody away. When you express hurt, you pull somebody closer. If you just said something that hurt me and I get angry at you, I create a distance between the two of us. Obviously when you did the hurtful thing, it created distance, but the anger is going to create more distance. If you did something hurtful and I say to you, that was really hurtful, I just brought us a little bit closer. And the ability to express hurt, the ability to be vulnerable enough to express hurt again, this goes on the list of one of the most important things in a marriage. Okay, we're down to the last two slides, and then I'm going to look at some of the questions that were here. Okay, in a problematic marriage, there is only room for two adults. In a happy marriage, there is room for two adults, but there is also room for all the little children that live inside of us. Growing up is really hard. And a happy marriage is often the only place in the world where we can safely express the lonely, scared, vulnerable child that is crouching inside of us. We all walk around with a kindergarten inside of us. We all walk around with all the unresolved stuff from our childhood, all the pain from our childhood, and we all walk around just with little kids who want to have fun inside of us. When I walk in the street, 99% or maybe even 100% of that little child inside of me has to stay hidden. That's not how I can express myself to the world. In a marriage, a happy marriage is the place where the child inside of me is able to come out. I can be real. I can be me. And very often in what happens, it's to me this is really sad. What happens in therapy is people come in very often, let's say in individual therapy, and they'll express things that are really just the little children inside of them. And I'm thinking to myself, why couldn't this person just say this to his wife? Or why couldn't she say this to her husband? And so often, the therapy works very often simply because it's the only place where the person was able to be vulnerable enough to express the little child inside of them. If marriage can do that, there's no reason why marriage shouldn't be able to do that. And in a happy marriage, it does that. Which brings us to the last slide. which is just an extension of this one, which is in a problematic marriage, we can share the practical and important parts of our inner world. And in a happy marriage, we can also share the irrelevant, the impossible, the silly, and the childish parts of our inner world. You can't know a person without knowing their dreams. You can't. You get the silly things about a person. And the more impossible, more childish the dreams, the better you'll know them. I had a guy once came into my office who was married with a bunch of kids and loved his children, loved his wife. He wasn't going anywhere. But a big part of his depression was he really, and this is not funny, this was serious, he really wanted to go to the Marines. He had a dream since he's 10 years old of joining the Marines. Now he's 35 years old with 5 kids and working behind a desk and depressed like anything. Now, no one, before he met me, no one knew he wanted to go to the Marines. It was to him, it was silly. I couldn't share this with anybody, right? Growing up in an Orthodox firm home in Muncie, Marines? Huh? What? But the dream of going to the Marines, the fact that he was able to share it with a therapist was so important for him. The fact that he was able to cry about it, grieve it. In a happy marriage, so the slide I just showed you was, in a problematic marriage, we can share the practical and important parts of our inner world. Going to the Marines was not a practical, important part of his inner world. It was, I mean, maybe it was important, but not in a practical way. When he was able to share that dream with his wife, which he eventually did, he was able to cry about it. They were able to talk, and he was able to process it. And that was the other side of the slide. It says, in a happy marriage, we can share the irrelevant, the impossible, the silly, the childish parts of our inner world. In a happy marriage, there is room for those parts of the inner world. And in a sad marriage, in a problematic marriage, we sadly do not have that ability. We have to contain, we have to hold that inside of us. So that's the presentation, that's the slides. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the questions. I really have not been looking at the questions as they were coming through. But I'm going to do that now. So here's the first question. Is the degree of not knowing realistic for people like us who have been married almost 50 years? Wow. Maybe 20 years ago. We know that some of our basic assumptions differ. I'm reading the question. We know that some of our basic assumptions differ and can live with that. But we do know what most of those assumptions are, and they don't have to cause fights. We can agree to disagree or try to convince the other to change or compromise without fighting. So yes, when you know each other for 50 years, you know each other much better. But let me throw something out there. If I were a nuclear physicist and I told you that I've been a nuclear physicist for 50 years and I know everything there is to know about nuclear physics, everything. So there's nothing more for me to know. I know it. I know it all. You probably would not want to study nuclear physics under me. You probably would walk away and say, wow, that guy is arrogant. There's no way he knows it. What about human beings? Human beings are probably way more complex than nuclear physics. What if I told you that I'm a therapist and I know everything there is about therapy? 50 years and I know everything there is about therapy. Again, you'd probably walk away. What if I said, I know everything there is to know about me? I've examined myself and I know everything there is to know about me. There's nothing more for me to explore. Human being has depth beyond depth beyond depth. There is always another layer to explore. If somebody tells you, I know everything there is to know about me, that's really, really sad. And I don't, and I never will. So if that applies to myself, if I will never, ever fully know me, why do I act the way I act? Why did I just do what I did? Why do I have this habit? Why do I get angry at those things? Why does that trigger me? Let me peel off another layer and another layer and another layer. And what about, maybe this goes back to when I was 3 years old, or maybe this goes back to when I was 5 years old. Maybe it goes back to some hardwiring that I have that I don't understand. There's always another layer. Human beings are that complex. and I will never, ever fully understand myself. Wouldn't that apply to my spouse also? Even after 50 years of marriage, there is so much to learn. And we are that complex. And you know, my hope for all of us is that when we're 95 years old, we'll still be trying to understand. You'll still be sitting down with our husbands and wives and saying, let's get to know each other. Let's find out. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation about silly things, about not practical things, so we can get to know each other. So yes, after 50 years of marriage, there's a lot that you know and a lot that you work around and you work with. Never forget how much you don't know about each other. Next question is, what's the approximate divorce rate amongst the Orthodox community? I'm not going to be able to answer this question, but let me read the question anyway, because it's an important question. Because I don't know the statistics. The question is, what's the approximate divorce rate amongst the Orthodox community? I would like to know comparatively to secularism. Yeshivish Orthodox community, not modern and not Hasidic. I don't know the answer to that. I know that the divorce rate is going up. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And, you know, you could argue it's a good thing because people are not getting stuck in bad marriages. The divorce rate definitely is lower than the secular world, but I don't know what the number is. I can't read the next question. I'm just going to read it. So whoever sent it could try to send it again. But what are the three responses to an argument? One is continue, contempt. The third. Okay, the third one was to yell, to shut down. It was contempt and stonewalling. I said that there were three responses to an argument, and I only addressed contempt and stonewalling. The third one is yelling, screaming, anger. Contempt and stonewalling are a way of controlling our anger. So people show contempt and people show stonewall because they're overwhelmed. Continued argument is healthy. I'm not sure if that's a question, but if it is, the answer is yes. Is a continued argument healthy? Is it healthy to continue an argument? So there is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, in Ethics of the Fathers, that the rabbis say that, I'll say the Hebrew and then I'll translate it, is any argument that's for the sake of heaven, the Hebrew words are sofa lehiskayim, which literally translated means the end, it will last. It's tough words to translate, but literally translated, it really means if an argument that's for the sake of heaven, any argument for the sake of heaven will last forever. And what does that mean? Why would I want an argument to last forever? And when I saw John Gottman's statistic of 70% of arguments in a marriage are unresolvable, I think I understood what the rabbis were saying, what the Mishnah was saying. An argument that lasts forever means, when does an argument end? An argument ends when there's stonewalling, when there's contempt, when there's anger, when there's yelling, when we stop talking to each other. If we don't do any of those things, if it's really about curiosity and love, and we care about each other, the argument can go on. I can continue to say, you know, I really feel like this. Well, I really feel like this. A continued argument is healthy, so long as it doesn't turn into a fight. So long as it's, I really feel like this. Yeah, but I really feel like this. I really feel like this. I really feel like this. That can go on forever, and there's nothing unhealthy about that. When and at what point does the continued argument become unhealthy? Was the question. It becomes unhealthy. The continued argument becomes unhealthy when it turns into a fight. As long as it's not a fight. Fight means a lot of the things that we discussed today. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. Fight means that we're showing contempt. Fight means that we're stonewalling. We're not talking to each other. We're yelling at each other. As long as it's about, fight means that we're criticizing or becoming defensive. As long as it's about, you know, I feel like this. Yeah, but I feel like this. I disagree with you. I disagree with that. That's okay. And that's healthy. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if you think about it, go back to John Gottman's 70% statistic. If 70%, 69% of our arguments, 7 out of every 10 of our arguments are not going to be resolved, shouldn't we approach every argument from that perspective? And I'm not going to convince you, and you're not going to convince me 70% of the time. So we might as well just go to a place of trying to understand each other instead of trying to convince each other. Okay, next question is, would you say relationships become transactional when a couple is only having conversations they need to have? That's a good statement. It's becoming transactional. I like that word. It's becoming dry. It's becoming, we really don't, if I'm having a conversation with you and I don't have to have this conversation, then the only reason why I'm having this conversation is because of the process. It's because I want to have a conversation with you. When you use the word transactional, it means really another way to say transactional is it's the content. We're focused so much on the content. When we have a conversation that we have to have, when we're talking about the kids, when we're talking about finances, the content is so important. So it's not about us, it's not about you and me. But when we have a conversation about nothingness, about stupidity, about meaningless things, then it's about you and me, it's not about the content. Okay, next question is, when my spouse and I attempt to have a discussion, she does not listen to my side and then gets upset when I don't want to have other discussions. My repeated experience is that she does not listen, so why even start a discussion? Wow. So without meeting you and your spouse, I wouldn't know what to tell you, but let me throw a few things out there that might be possibilities. Sometimes, and I don't know that this is what's going on, but sometimes when my spouse doesn't want to listen to me, I just said something, my spouse just can't hear me. Sometimes, not always. Remember, I said at the beginning, I put a disclaimer up at the beginning that, sometimes there are, everything I'm saying tonight applies as long as there's no mental illness, as long as there are no personality disorders, as long as there's no trauma. We're talking about two normal, healthy people who are just not, how do they get along? How do they not get along? So sometimes a spouse not listening is indicative of a problem, and we need therapy and we need help. Sometimes a spouse not listening might be indicative of me not listening. I will be more open to listening to you once I feel you're open to listening to me. If I feel my spouse is not listening, if somebody says to me, my spouse is not listening, what should I do? She should not listen to my side and then gets upset when I don't want to have another discussion. She's not listening to my side. Sometimes what I'll ask spouses to do is, if your wife or your husband is not listening to you, the first thing to try is you listen better. Because once I feel heard, I'm more open to listening. Okay, here's a scary question. What if the couple tries to date again and sees that they would not want to continue the date? Can the marriage be saved? Wow. If you date again, and you find that you don't want to continue the date, yes, the marriage very often, probably usually, can be saved. You may need a coach. You may need a couples therapist to help you date. If you haven't dated in 10 years, you may need help dating. You may have lost. There was a time where you were dating, and at some point it did work. There may be 10 years, 20 years of anger, pain, frustration, knowing each other that's getting in the way now, and maybe you cannot have a good date at this point. Don't assume that means that the marriage cannot be saved. It means that the marriage needs help. Okay, next question. Somehow there needs to be a solution to these minor disagreements. Will the room be cold or warm? Or do you sleep in separate bedrooms? That's not good either. Okay. Great question. So what do we do? I didn't speak much about, so what do we do? Okay, we talk and we get to know each other, and But what do we do? Is the window open or is the window closed? So I gave one example of that, a silly example with the couple in waiting online in the supermarket. But what you'll find very often, not always, but most of the time, when a couple starts to talk, when a couple starts to try to understand each other, when a couple tries to start understanding each other, what different things emerge. What you do, the question is, how do we resolve these minor disagreements? Will the room be cold or warm? What do we do? And I can't answer that. I don't know. I don't know if the window's going to be open or closed. I don't know. But if you continue talking to each other, you'll come up with something. You'll come up with an answer. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I had a couple once arguing over what time the husband was coming home very late. And this was not about work. This was about things he was doing after work. Spending time with friends. He would very often stop off and have a good time with some friends on his way home from work. Or it would just, he didn't go straight from work to the house. And the wife was complaining that he comes home late. And then sometimes he would even go out afterwards. He would come home at 7 o'clock, stay home for 2 hours, and then as soon as the kids were sleeping, he would go out for, I'll be back in a half hour, and then come back 2 hours later, show up at 11:30 at night. Now, my initial instinct obviously was to yell at this guy, and bang his head against the wall a few times, as that's to be a decent husband. That usually will not work. So I try to help them have a conversation, because what he was saying was, they were yelling at each other. She was saying that's not how you behave. That's not how a husband behaves. And he was saying, all my friends do this, so why are you picking? No, their wives let, so why can't I do it? And the sad part is he was right. His friends' wives, I guess, for some, he was able to meet his friends and hang out because their wives were probably going through the same thing. Let their husbands do it, whatever let means. After a while, this conversation was going nowhere. And again, yelling at him probably wouldn't have done anything. I asked them to have a conversation where they just, instead of criticizing each other, instead of him telling her, there's nothing wrong with this. Everybody does this. All my friends do this. Instead of her telling him, nobody does this. That's not the way husbands behave. I had them have a conversation where the focus was just on how each one felt, a non-criticism conversation. And this was really hard because what a non-criticism conversation looks like is, so what does it feel like for you? And it took about 10 minutes, but what she ended up saying was, I asked her to say, when you come home late, I feel, and finish the sentence. And obviously it started off with, when you come home late, I feel like you're a jerk. And that's no good. Finally, she said, when you come home late, I feel lonely. And there was like silence in my office. And she looked at her and said, you never said that. He was quiet for like 10 seconds. And I said, you never said that. You never told me that. And she said, I've been screaming that for 10 years. And he said, no, you've been screaming that I was wrong. You're screaming that I never heard the words, you're lonely. So now there's a new dynamic here. There's a wife saying I'm lonely, and he has to deal with that. It's not about whether what he's doing is wrong or right. It's about my wife being lonely. But then it was his turn. And what he said was, when I have to come home on time, I feel choked. I feel choked. This is a guy who was ADHD to the moon and just felt choked having to come home one night. Now you have a real conversation. Forget about who's right or who's wrong. Forget about, you have a wife who's home lonely and a husband who feels choked if he comes home. You have a real conversation. It's a different conversation. And it's no longer about, should I come home? It's not a black and white conversation. It's a very gray conversation. And what ended up with this couple is they ended up going out together. And, she said, maybe, if I go out with you at night, pick me up, right after work, pick me up. He said, yeah, but you don't like going out. She said, I don't. I know, I don't. But it's better than being home alone. And then and then it's okay, if I go out with you tonight, will you come home early tomorrow night? They kind of worked it out. And it works. It works. And they ended up with a beautiful marriage that really works with these huge differences. They're not fighting anymore. So going back, that was a long answer to the question, where do you find the solution? The solution to all these minor disagreements or major disagreements is in getting to understand each other. It's not about who's right or who's wrong. It's about I'm lonely and I have ADHD. Okay, somebody put up the, if you look at the chat, somebody put up the 5 love languages test. It's 5lovelanguages.com/quizzes. If you want to find out what your love language is. And that's actually a really good thing to do for a husband and wife to sit down and figure out what their love languages are. Next question. If a marriage is problematic, what is the most important lesson you've shared to implement to try to take the relationship to a good marriage? Like I said, there are so many important things in a marriage. So there's so many things that I would say are the most important. If a marriage is in trouble, the first thing you want to do, the starting point, I'm not going to say it's the most important, but I would say it's the starting point. It's be open to exploration. Be open with what I started with. Be open to, maybe I don't know you. Maybe I don't know you. Maybe there's something here that I can learn about you. How do I work on being a person who criticizes less? After all, if I don't point it out to him, he'd never notice and fix the behavior. How do you criticize less? So that goes to what I said. Every criticism could also be expressed as a need. And that's really the work. The work of how do I become a person who criticizes less is, instead of focusing on what you're doing wrong, can I focus on what that's doing to me? Right? If you're coming home late from work, instead of saying you are coming home late from work, let me say, I'm really lonely when you come home late from work. That's how you work on criticism. Don't work on criticism by not saying anything. I don't want to criticize, so I'm not going to say anything. That's not sustainable. You work on criticism by saying, what is your action doing to me? And let me express what it's doing to me. How does one transition from one extreme to the other? Is it awareness or tools needed or therapy? Awareness, tools needed, therapy, all of the above. If you're having trouble with any of the things that I expressed, awareness is very important. Awareness means what's happening inside of me. Awareness does not mean what is my spouse doing. Awareness means me and my spouse are not, this is not happening. This is, we're clashing. The first place I may go when we clash is you. Awareness means, let me also go to me. What's happening inside of me? What's happening inside of my world? Only then are tools needed, and if that fails, then therapy can really help. And here is the last question. What if the spouse is so focused on the newspaper, puzzles during the breakfast, and doesn't respond when the wife wants to have conversation before work? Talk about it. Again, I would go back to the criticism and defensiveness. Instead of saying, you're always looking at the newspaper, and I try to talk to you, and you're not focused on me, and you're not how about, I know you're going to leave to work soon. I'm going to spend the whole day without you, and it would mean so much to me if you could look up from the newspaper and just make eye contact. I would feel so much better. It would mean a lot to me. It would change my day. And when you don't do that, when you just look at the newspaper, it makes me feel lonely. Did you hear one criticism in that? There was no criticism in that. That's, okay. I'll wait another 5 seconds if there are any other questions, but there's not, just in closing, I did not, this is not, like if you want to know how to have a good marriage, this is it. No, there is so much to learn about marriage. And there is so much to learn about each other, and it's an ongoing process. And I would just hope that this is the beginning, because one of the things I started with was it's about not knowing each other. You don't know each other. Spend a lifetime exploring each other. And thanks for listening.